All right, what's up, everybody? Got a special guest on today. Got a few cool topics for you. So I'm sure most of you guys know who this is, but NH, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello YouTube, this is Natural Hypertrophy here speaking. I'm a natural bodybuilder. I am a YouTuber that focuses entirely on bodybuilding with some philosophy on the side. And I'm part of this community that has been growing for the past few years of natural lifters who are trying to reclaim the platform.
Yeah, so as you guys know, if you've been lifting since before the past few years, natural bodybuilding and natural lifting did start to die out quite a bit, especially on social media. I think we've had a lack of people to learn from. And I think NH is just a great example of someone that took natural lifting and pushed beyond what the limits that we thought were. And he's got a lot of cool information, has a great experience in lifting, almost similar to myself in some ways, comparing strength versus size and getting caught up in certain methods of lifting. So I do want to go over a few things with him on that today. So I guess the first thing I want to dive into a little bit is something I touched on recently, as you guys know, if you've been following the channel. It's chasing performance in the logbook versus focusing more on technique and how to strike that balance. So I guess NH, for you, what do you value the balance between the logbook and emphasizing technique? I guess for myself, to put some context here, I have a very passive approach to progression in the gym. I kind of just let it happen. I know some people try and like chase strength and force it a little bit more. I've had more success being a little bit more passive with it and chasing hard sets, which is something that I talked about with Steve Shaw from Massive Iron. But I do want to know, I guess, your overall approach when it comes to that.
So, of course, I log my training, I log all of my lifts, and I keep a close eye on the way that I lift because I always want to be close to failure. I always want to be very intense. But something that I've done in the modification in my approach in the past few years has been that, like any new lifters, I used to be the guy that would obsess on putting weight on the bar. Right? I wanted that number to go up. This was my number one priority. And in my head, this correlated with hypertrophy. I was going to get bigger that way. What I found, however, is that it didn't work because eventually you reach a wall. And that wall is when the technique starts to fail. Because when you want weight on the bar so bad, you tend to sacrifice technique. And at first it works, right? On the deadlift, for example, it works. You can deadlift horribly and the weight will still go up. But then when you stop being able to add weight, now you're stuck for real. Because this technique that you've been using doesn't allow you to get stronger anymore. And all of that came from the fact that you wanted to get stronger in the first place. So now I do something similar to what you do. I just let it happen. I know the weight is going to go up. If you hit your reps within a certain rep range with certain intensity, eventually to be able to keep being intense and to stay in that rep range, you're going to have to add weight, because if you don't, you're going to have to do more reps to satisfy the same necessity for failure. So the weight naturally goes up. And I have found that on the long run, this method actually allows you to progressively overload more than the previous one. So even though you don't go as fast at first, within 1, 2, or 3 years, you would see, if you compare the two methods, that you actually outdid the fast pace of the first one if you just stick to that. And that sounds very nebulous, but to connect back to what you said, all of it is simple. Focus more on the way you lift the weights and why you lift the weights, what muscle you want to grow, instead of just trying to lift to move the weight from point A to point B. And once that mentality shift occurs, I think that's when bodybuilding really starts.
I agree. And to put it in the simpler terms for anybody that's new to this type of topic, the way that I like to explain this is it's adding weight when necessary. So you add weight when you have to. And I do enjoy to have a progression scheme that, or not a scheme, a progression guideline that allows me to do that. So rep goal system, for example, versus adding weight when possible. One of the biggest mistakes I made in NH, I know you're in the same boat. I think you had a video on this a while back where, if you've been following either of our channels, you know the biggest mistake that at least I made, and I think you're in the same boat there, is we rushed the progression. We added weight every time it was possible. So if I was able to increase my mobility to arch more on a bench and I could add 20 pounds to my 1 rep max or 10 pounds to my working sets or whatever, I would do it. And I could get out of, not that I wasn't training hard because I was, but I didn't have to, because I could keep leveraging into more weight. And every time I had any opportunity to add weight, I would. So I'm at the absolute maximum capacity. I have to have whatever the lifting gear was. So like certain equipment, like a belt, elbow sleeve, stuff like this, optimizing technique. I would keep using whatever I could to just keep adding weight. But when it comes to hypertrophy, I think the best method to use is to add weight when do it when it's necessary. So stick with a weight until you're so good at it and you have to increase weight. So you take a progression guideline, like I was talking about, like the rep goal system, where eventually you get so good at that weight that your reps get too high. And at that point, it's better to make that trade, go a little bit heavier in weight, drop the reps a little bit, and just grow from that slightly heavier weight. So I didn't chase anything. It just happened naturally. And it allowed me to focus on my technique, build the most muscle I could from that weight, from those sets that I was doing with that.
Yeah, and that connects to a saying that many people have heard before, which is get as much as you can from as little weight as you can. This also sounds nebulous, and some people would say, well, what does that mean? You lift lightweight? No, you still go to failure. But I believe that a lot of people take, for example, the action of retaking a weight like a curse, like they did something wrong. Oh, I benched 205 last time for 6, and now I still got 205 for 6, so I'm plateauing. Not necessarily. It just means that the weight now is still enough to challenge you. You shouldn't be mad about it. You should be glad about it. You're still growing from this. Of course, if this plateau lasts for 3, 4, 5 weeks, now it's a problem and we have to change it because you're not getting any additional reps or weight on the bar. But for 1 or 2 times, retaking weights for an advanced lifter, and you know that, is part of the game. Right? You're not going to add weight every single session. That logbook, when you get started, it's exciting because every session you add a new number, right? You're going up in weight. But at some point, you will scarcely visit the notebook. And it will be once in a while. And that once in a while will be plenty. I think that a lot of programs, sadly, base all of their progression schemes on weight on the bar. Starting strength is a good example. The 5x5, 3x5 approach, these rep ranges, in my opinion, are bad for hypertrophy because the only way forward is weight on the bar. You're not adding reps, you're not adding sets. Those sets and reps are fixated, they're static. So to progressively overload, it's weight on the bar. And this gets stuck in people's heads because they end up thinking that this is all there is to progressively overloading, even though we both know that it's only one portion and it might not even be the most important.
Yeah, 100%. That's a great point. So when you take something like a static rep range and you get hooked on that, especially as a beginner, a lot of us tend to get kind of nostalgic and almost put our initial gains on a pedestal and the methods that we use to get them. So you take something like a 5x5, 3x5, where your sole focus in the gym is to add weight to the bar because that's the only method of progression you're actually using. You get addicted to it. And once that runs out, then you're going to do whatever's possible to add weight. So you get into what I was saying earlier, you add weight when possible. So for myself, when I was getting started in the whole 5x5 thing, which is, I wasn't a beginner, I was more of an intermediate because I actually built a base from solid bodybuilding training, which the conclusions that I've come to now, the way I trained when I first started was actually probably 75 or 80% right. I think the pillars of what I used were the conclusions I've come to now. But like I look back to those times where I was doing 5x5, and yeah, I probably put on 30 pounds in all my lifts, but it's because I kept changing my technique and I was adding weight when possible. So like you were saying, it's one of those things where having multiple methods of progression and understanding how each one works is going to be key when you're trying to build muscle, because at the end of the day, muscle's built in multiple different ways of progression, not just weight on the bar.
Yeah, and on top of that, the goal also is to be able to do that for a long time. And this attempt at always putting weight on the bar has a tendency to redline the body, which is why a lot of people get injured on starting strength. It's because, well, if you can't push forward with weight on the bar, what do? There's no way out of it. So you have a wall and you're supposed to ram your head into that wall until it breaks. And usually what breaks first is your body. And I think that you have a similar experience to that, where you spoke about the action of adding implements or accessories to the body to be able to lift more, like straps or wraps or whatever. What are these things? Well, I think these things are band-aids you put on the body to artificially inflate the weight so as to be able to tell yourself, oh, look, I'm progressing. And I was one such guy as well. Now I'm at the completely different opposite end, where I believe personally that you should be able to take your hard sets with a calm, collected approach, with no or minimal equipment on you, and it should be like another day in the office. For me, I don't get hyped up anymore. I don't get like maddened, and I just approach the bar. I'm like, all right, I know for a fact I can get this for 8. I don't need to be in that special mindset or place. It's pure physics. I will get this for 8, and I do. But I remember a time where I would approach the bar thinking, oh my God, if I'm not perfect in every single aspect, this set will not go right. And this was additional stress that piles up that eventually also turns the training into something that you don't enjoy anymore. And now you lost on both fronts.
Yeah, like you were saying earlier, when you set a new PR and you set a new performance standard, there's no going back. And of course there is. I'm speaking in how my mindset used to be. But once you get to a certain number, well, shit, now I got to do more. Now I have to either get more reps or add more weight to the bar. And you pigeonhole yourself into, you keep moving the floor up, and eventually the floor is higher than what it should be. And you're stuck using all these weird techniques and methods to keep the strength progressing. So that's when not only your technique changes, but your programming changes too. Because if you are perfectly associating your 1 rep max or your total strength output in terms of weight on the bar for those lifts, you're going to use lifting methods and rep ranges, technique, etc., that allows your strength to progress faster. So when I was at my peak strength and I had this big fat powerlifting total, and I'm like, why am I not any bigger? That's what happened to me. Is I let myself get too caught up in those numbers, and my program stopped having the necessary volume requirements that I needed to actually build muscle. The proximity to failure, yeah, it was there for some lifts, but a lot of lifts I half-assed. Like I wouldn't train my curls seriously because what does that carry over to a 1 rep max on a lift that supposedly is building me all this muscle? So your technique starts to change, but also your program starts to change. And I was curious if did you ever follow a program that started off as hypertrophy and you slowly biased it towards letting your strength progress a little bit faster?
Yeah, I think that it's something that happened a lot to people roughly 10 years ago when there was this big powerlifting fad on YouTube. And a lot of young lifters got sucked into it because we were not only told that powerlifting was the best for strength, we were also lied to and told that it was the best for size.
Yeah.
And because the powerlifting community was so dominant, no one was there to say, hey, that's not true. These methods are not proper for hypertrophy. So I ended up training like a powerlifter, and a shitty one at that, because I wasn't even that strong. But slowly but surely, and this is something that you can even see with graphs, my volume started to temper down because I had to make space and room for intensity for all of these heavy sets close to failure I was doing with low reps. And you don't even notice it at first, but it creeps up on you. And then you get to a point where, sure, now you're stronger, but it doesn't reflect on your body. And this is when I keep insisting, where I keep repeating that strength doesn't equal size, because it's these types of, in a sense, simplistic statements that lead people to think that, all right, well, if strength equals size, I'll just get stronger. But how? The way in which you get stronger matters more than the strength that you add. If you get stronger on 1 rep max, on 3 rep maxes, and you completely shut your volume down, you're not going to get bigger from this. I guarantee you that. Whereas if you got stronger on an 8 to 12 rep range with proper technique, now you could claim that strength equals size, but it's a completely different method and a completely different beast. And to hook it back to what you said also, when it comes to pushing the floor so high that now you're on unstable ground, a very simple method that I use personally, and I recommend the people that listen to us right now do as well, is how comfortable are you with the current weight you're using? And do you have the faith and confidence in the fact that you can get it every single session? To me, if you can get 205 on the bench, this should be your new normal. You should not regress back from it, and it shouldn't be a weight where one day you go in and you lost 4 reps. If that happens to me, it shows that this baseline of strength that you should be using to build size is no baseline. It's too high. You need to go back down.
Okay. And what do you think causes that change in baseline strength? Do you think that's just a change in program and a change in like your peak strength, quote unquote?
Well, it could be 2 things. It could be day-to-day life. So sometimes we have one of these days. Sometimes you get into the gym, you feel recovered, you feel rested, you feel good. You put, I don't know, like your walking weight on the overhead press, you get 4 reps, you're like, either this doesn't feel good or I'm fatiguing way too fast, or clearly my strength is not there today. This happens. If it happens more than once every 3 weeks, then there is another problem that needs to be addressed. Most likely it is programming. And if that's the case, if it's a recurrent theme that your working weight ain't really your working weight, because sometime like 1 out of 5 times you can't use it to get your working set and your hard sets, then this might mean either that you're not recovering, so the programming and the frequencies are on point, or that this weight might be too high. And I don't like telling people to, you know, go back down. I'm not saying strip the bar and start from the bar. I'm saying maybe try taking 10 pounds off and see if you can see if you can stabilize. Tonnage stability in bodybuilding is huge because it's what allows that creeping up effect of adding tonnage. If you're not stable and you constantly take those dips, you're not really doing anything. You're just staying at a baseline because it's not your baseline.
Yeah, one of the biggest things that I like to do is when I get to a crossroads where typically, let's say I'm using the rep goal system, if I get to a point where I have to add more weight when my reps get pretty high, I like to do an assessment where, do I need to do a technique reset? Am I really ready to go up in weight? And that's just, I look at that, it's film. So I look at film, I look at how the set felt, and just as corny as it sounds, like how is the pump? How is the burn? Or did I feel a term that Mike Israetel from Renaissance Periodization uses, disruption? I think that's a great way to put it. Do you feel disruption in that target muscle? And if you're not really feeling any of that, but your performance on paper is there, I think that might be a good time to say, hey, well, maybe you don't need to strip the bar back to the basics and super lightweight, but maybe maintain that rep performance that you're at with the same weight, maybe lose a couple reps, whatever, but progress in your technique, stick with that. And then once your technique's good and you're hitting that performance that looked good on paper, that's now a good time to go up in weight.
Yeah. And it's in a sense, it separates different types of failures as well. Something that I've been discussing on the channel as well, and other people have been pointing out as very important. Not all failure is equal, right? You have technical failure and you have legitimate failure. So technical failure would be, for example, you do a set of squats and you get 8 reps, but at rep 6, you start to good morning the weight up, right? If you train for quote unquote strength for performance, people will tell you, well, who cares? The weight went up, and they're right. But for a bodybuilder, now there's a disruption because you're not working the target muscle anymore. Your quads are out of the equation. You're using all lower back and glutes. So this means that your failure was at 6, not at 8. You should have stopped the set at 6. This is my personal approach. And it's on the spectrum of reps in reserve. This also means that for the most part, I do reps in reserve. But the reps that I keep in reserves are the ugly ones. And I know that, again, for powerlifters, there's no such thing as an ugly rep. But for bodybuilders, there are ugly reps, not because we care about the aesthetic of the performance, but because an ugly rep is a rep that is not doing what you want it to do. So this is the part of the training that needs to be trimmed off, because now you can legitimately progress. Too many times, if you let form degrade, yeah, sure, the weight goes up, but it goes up in an illegitimate fashion. So you're not reaching the type of value that you actually want.
That's a good point. A lot of people, and this is something that I do plan on talking about soon, no rep count or hitting a certain rep total is magical. The only time it is somewhat magical is if you have the exact same technique, or at least within a statistical similarity to what you've been using previously. Then when you add weights, when you add reps, that's a good thing. And that's a sign that you're probably building muscle. A lot of people get so caught up in achieving this number. So the way I see the rep goal system, there'll be people that kind of almost abuse it in a way where they think if they have to hit 35 reps across 3 sets and they're doing whatever they can to get to that 36th rep. Well, now the 36th rep means nothing because you took away the baseline of what makes that 36th rep good. So you get people that get so caught up in hitting that number and hitting the goal. And that's why I preach a little bit more of a passive approach to progression, because when you get so caught up in this number, you do whatever you can. And the 36th rep on a three sets for 35 total rep goal system, now it's almost becoming what a strength standard is. So you take something like the 315 bench that we're all striving for when we were in the powerlifting, power building era, and what is set out to be a goal for us to try and achieve and get big by the time we get there. Now we're slowly taking little shortcuts and taking the faster road because supposedly strength equals size. And now this is when you become too numbers focused and too program focused. That becomes an issue because now it takes the base out from under you, and you're no longer building muscle as much as you should be. You're mostly building strength, and your program starts to bias strength.
And it's a trap that even at our level, I don't know about you, but we also have to stay very aware of, because I know that the lure and the sirens of performance are always around the corner, because we're humans, right? We're guys. We like to perform. We like to move heavy weight. That's cool. It's fun. And we also want to feel like we're getting something done in the gym. But times and times again, when I feel that sensation creep into me, I have to reset and think, okay, this is not the way to go, right? You're falling for that trap again. I'm doing Romanian deadlifts, right? Right now I'm using 385 or 395 for my walking sets. I know for a fact I could move much more weight if I just sped up the negative and if I bent the knee more, because I have very strong quads, so I could use more leg drive. But that's not why I do Romanian deadlifts for. I do them for hamstrings and for posterior chain. So I'm going to keep a stricter and less unlocked knee, and I'm going to actually suffer through the negative. Am I losing pounds on the bar doing this? Yeah, but adding pounds on the bar would not actually make the lift more efficient for hypertrophy. So it's something to always keep in mind. Just because you can add weight doesn't mean that you should add weight. You have to be able to justify that. Do I have an obligation to add weight? The only way where you have an obligation to add weight is if you cannot at this point reach failure or get any relevant work done with the current rep range you're using. Then you add weight. Now it's perfectly normal. You have to. It's slower that way. You're not getting as strong as fast, but that's sort of the point.
Agreed. It makes a lot of sense, especially when you go through that experience and you learn that firsthand. That's something that really hits home. I was so caught up in a performance-oriented mindset that if I ever did less than I did last time or didn't hit a PR, the rest of the session would just be garbage and I'd start to question everything. I didn't just think I'd maintain. I thought that if I dropped my weight down a little bit, I would actually lose size. But you're completely ignoring technique and proximity to failure and these things that actually drive hypertrophy. So what I like to think about for my own training is don't focus so much on the numbers. Like I said, let that be a little bit more passive. Focus on chasing stimulation, chase the hard set. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that looking at the first set and basing the entirety of your workout on that first set makes or breaks bodybuilding training. Because I do something called strength work that I've been preaching on the channel that contains the name strength. So you could say, okay, well, isn't that contradictory? But for me, the reason why I call it strength work is because I want people to know that this is the least important part of the training in terms of volume. This is the part of the training that I do where I do my hardest sets with my lowest reps with the compound movement that is going to give me the most stimulus overall. This is for progression. The progression of the rest of the lifts, not for the sake of this progression. I don't do close grip bench press just to get stronger at close grip bench press. I do it because I know it has a strong carryover to my chest strength and performance that I can then use to get more reps on other movements I do for chest. And this is where all of the actual stimulus comes from. I think that this opening session, this strength work that I like to call, should be 10 to 15% of your total volume. The rest of the workout makes up the bulk and the majority of what will make you big. So focusing on that opening in terms of performance is a mistake, especially if you let it dictate the way the rest of the training goes. You've been there, I've been there, we've all been there. You want to hit a bench PR and you fell. And you fell in a spectacular fashion where you get the bar slammed on you and now you feel bad. And then you send back the rest of your training because you are all down in the dumpsters. This is the issue, right? You cared so much about something that did not matter that now what actually matters, the rest of the volume, you did not do properly. Once that mentality is shifted and you understand, okay, this opening act of the strength work is just there to prepare me for the rest of the session. And then this is go time. Then this is the money time that actually starts. It repairs your mindset.
And for everybody listening, he summed it up so well right there. I think you're just putting it perfectly. So many of us tend to bias that opening lift, the heaviest lift that we're doing that day, and then we call everything else accessory work. And just to be a little bit ironic here. So NH, that strength work that you do you think you would be able to appropriately call that accessory work for your bodybuilding work?
I absolutely would, because it's the reason why I do it. I don't do deadlifts to grow. I do deadlifts because it's the best way to bump my strength up on RDLs and to get more volume. So my deadlift is my accessory lift for the remaining deadlift.
I love to hear that. I think that's great. So it's actually kind of funny because the next topic that I had written down was talking about the accessory lift mindset. And I know you kind of touched on it there. This is a staple to my channel. This is a staple to my training philosophies. One of the worst, this is the worst mistake I ever made, in my opinion. I treated every lift that wasn't an SBD or a variation of that like an accessory lift. And when I first made my channel, obviously I know what accessory means. It's pretty straightforward, but the literal definition of accessory is something that is inferior to a bigger thing. It's a small aspect that is only used to help something that's bigger than itself. So when you apply the term accessory lift to something like an overhead extension, a bicep curl, or even a lift that trains like a quote unquote bigger muscle group in your body, I would call these lifts accessories in my program. When you're calling it something that you subconsciously recognize is inferior to something that is obviously bigger than itself in the program, now you have a hierarchy within your training session. And of course, not every lift is going to be equal or be the same, but it should be more of like an apples and oranges approach versus a 10 minutes left in this. Just got some notification, whatever. That just completely distracted me. But it should be more of like an apples and oranges thing. Like your tricep pushdowns are, of course, different than an RDL, but that doesn't mean the RDLs are by far and away more important than the tricep pushdowns, because when it comes to bodybuilding, your physique is one, your physique is all equal. When it comes to something like powerlifting, where you have these hierarchical training structures, yeah, your tricep pushdown is by nature an accessory to your bench press because it's less important. You can tricep push down the whole stack with a couple dumbbells on top of it, but if it doesn't transfer over to your bench press, that means nothing. So when you get rid of this hierarchy in your mindset, in your approach to your training, that's the true magic of bodybuilding. That's when you can actually develop a complete physique. So I look back at my old physique, and yeah, like my spinal erectors, glutes they were pretty jacked because I was deadlifting a bunch of weight, doing some RDLs and whatnot, and mostly from low bar squats as well. But my arms were garbage. I had no abs. I still don't have abs because even though I'm relatively lean, I never isolated them. It was always an accessory. It was always an afterthought. And that's something that totally screwed me over.
This hierarchy that you were speaking about is something that we could also call priorities. And a priority is, by definition, something that is subjective. We all have our own priorities. The thing with powerlifting and any strength sport is that you are dictated your priorities. You don't get to pick. It's the sport that tells you, hey, this is what matters. So either you're in and you train for that sport and you win, or you're not and you have your own priorities, but that makes you a completely different person. If you're a powerlifter and you do curls and you allocate a lot of your training for biceps, for example, I would argue that you are a bad powerlifter because your priorities are out of whack. You're training a muscle group that is not needed, and you'll hear powerlifters say, oh, it's not a main mover. Yeah, it's the big mover mindset. That's fine for them. They will always train the parts of the body that gets them the biggest total. It's logical. But if you're a bodybuilder, that never applies. And yet you still see bodybuilders who will tell you, oh, always prioritize compound movements, even at the detriment of smaller isolation movements, because they build the most muscle. Okay, great. That's technically true. But what is your physique going to look like? So you're going to have a massive chest, you're going to have massive glutes and massive legs, and then not much of anything else. That's not a good physique. For the most part, that is a pretty horrendous physique. You're going to get outdone by a guy who does a bro split, because at least he'll be sort of balanced because he'll be training every single portion of the body. So to me, that's also why natural bodybuilding and its resurgence is so great. It's telling people, hey, you get to decide what you want. No one gets to tell you, oh, you have to do this. No, I'm the one who owns this body. I will do with it what I want. I will decide my priorities and I will decide my accessories. So for me, for example, I love arms. I want bigger arms. So every single movement for triceps and biceps is going to be a priority at the detriment of other movements that I think are not that good. And this also allows, again, a more complete approach, because with powerlifting, you have to dedicate a lot of your time to these main movers, but also to the specificity of the lifts, because those lifts are very technical. You have to train them all the time. You have to keep the neurological adaptation patterns very high all the time. So you don't have space for a lot else. I remember talking to a lot of powerlifters, and they would tell me something like, well, I could do some more incline pressing for my upper chest and my shoulders, but that would take away from my specific bench work. Or I could work abs, but why would I work abs? It's just cosmetic, when I could do something like a set of squats that would be better for core strength. I don't disagree with that mindset, it's great for them. But for a bodybuilder, this is just not the proper approach.
I agree. Yeah, I fell for that trap as well. So what you're saying, and this is something obviously I agree on, I just made a video on it last week about how do you find your priorities? Like you said, with powerlifting, your priorities are chosen for you. And that's a sport, and that's the nature of it, and that's fine. But when it comes to bodybuilding, the way I view it is don't look at the lifts. And this is a video that I talked about. It might have been my first video that I ever made on the channel, where you get so caught up in people tell you what the best lifts are for hypertrophy. And there's always a hierarchy. It's always squat, bench, deadlift, or something similar to that at the start, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it definitely can be. When you focus so much on these lifts being the best, you lose sight of you being able to determine what you want your physique to look like. So an example that I made, I think in that video is, well, what if my forearms are a higher priority than my chest? Are finger curls and wrist curls still an accessory and still something that's a small detail to the program compared to a bench press? But if I don't care about my chest as much, shouldn't I be prioritizing my forearm training? And I know that's kind of an extreme example. I like chest and forearms equally, but if that was the case, hypothetically, now that whole hierarchy kind of collapses.
And on top of that, you could also get to a point in your training where this is where I'm sitting right now, where your chest is already so developed that any amount of work you put into chest is not going to get you much. It's still going to grow. But if you took a fraction of this and you fed it to the forearms, you would actually see massive results. And it's something that I've started to do, where I've been obsessed with forearm development as of late. And the results I'm seeing, I've opened my eyes also to the fact that I had fell for the idea and notion that certain muscle groups needed more work and that others couldn't handle as much. It's people who tell you, oh, it's a small muscle, it recovers slow. That's not what I found. It recovers slow because you never train it. You have lower capacity. Isn't that strange that everyone is able to squat 3 times a week or doing heavy pressing 3 times a week, but no one is able to do bicep curls heavy 3 times a week? It's the nature of the beast. It's because everyone starts in the gym spamming bench press and spamming squats. So you train these strengths, you train these muscles to recover very fast because they have to adapt to the demand, but you train arms or forearms once a week, if you even train them. And then when you start to become serious about bodybuilding, you pick them up and you're like, oh, I'm very tired. This must mean that I have to do low frequency. No, you have to train that muscle like you train the other ones. It's something that I also used to say on the channel. If you trained your arms with the same intensity that you train your legs, you would have as big as arms as you have legs in relation to the size of the muscle, of course. This is why many natural bodybuilders have huge legs and they have small arms, is because their priorities are still skewed and they have yet to actually correct it.
All right, so I think one of the most interesting things I'm seeing with the attention that we pay to isolation lifts and all this kind of stuff is we've all kind of fallen, not that we've all fallen for the trap, but we've all heard this before, that you don't need to isolate your abs, and you can just get away with doing overhead press, squat, bench, deadlift to develop your abs and develop your ab strength. And it's true that you can get away with probably not doing a whole ton of isolation for your abs and still getting strong. But this is horrible advice for hypertrophy. And I think the perfect example is you take someone like NH, who has arguably abs as his best muscle group, or at least up there for sure. There's something that I think stands out on your physique. And then you take someone like myself, where I never isolated my abs directly, but I had a big powerlifting total. So my core and my abs were able to handle these big weights, not just for 1 rep maxes, but also for endurance too. But with an insufficient range of motion and without actually isolating them, there's a reason why I don't have abs. And it's not like I had to do ab training to get to this big squat or the big deadlift or overhead press, because those movements developed them enough so I could keep getting stronger in those movements. But then you look at someone like NH, who I think we both had probably similar powerlifting totals back when we were focusing a little bit more on strength, but you've been isolating your abs versus me, where I just started doing it a couple weeks ago. And I think when you look at my abs compared to yours, we might be a similar body fat percentage. You might be a little bit leaner than me at this point, but the abs, in terms of muscularity, it's night and day.
It's the natural conclusion of ignoring a muscle, right? And we've sort of all been there. I'm there with calves, where I have puny calves, and I've started training them really seriously a few years ago, and I'm seeing results. But now I'm sort of scolding myself for not starting earlier, because I realized I left a ton of gains on the table. But with calves, at the end of the day, you can say, well, calves don't really matter. I disagree, but they don't matter as much as abs. Abs really are the centerpiece of the physique. They're in the middle of the physique, so that's where the eyes go. And I'm seeing a lot of bodybuilders who are very stringent with their shoulders, their arms. Everything is on point. Then you look at the core, and they have a flat belly. So sure, it's flat, they're lean, but you don't see any definition. There's no muscularity here. And to me, that's a tragedy. And it's a tragedy that was caused by, again, this I would say, propaganda of, oh, just do your compound movements and you'll get abs, which to me points to two things. One, people have a tough time reconciling theory and reality, because every single person I've ever heard say that didn't have a six-pack. They didn't even have nice abs. So it's like, why are you taking advice from someone who doesn't have what you want? Clearly, they don't know what they're talking about. And two, it's once again people who train for strength who give advice for hypertrophy by colluding strength and size. So what they really should be saying is, you can develop your core strength by doing only squat, bench, and deadlift and overhead press. That is true. You do not need to do a single rep of isolation to get a stronger core, because the action of bracing and the action of resting the weight is a technical action with some strength component to it. But none of it includes the stretch. It's all isometric contraction of the abs because you're bracing. The stretching component is what makes the abs grow. It's what gives the six-pack and the separation between the abs. So you could be the exact opposite and be a powerlifter that has horrible core strength and have a beautiful six-pack. You see all of these guys on Instagram that rock the automotive physique. They're very lean and with a nice six-pack. You put 225 on their back, they break in half like a twig. It's the two woods, and you can get somewhat of both. I'm someone who has a decent core strength. I can squat 4 plates, I can deadlift 5 plates, and I also have a six-pack. You don't have to pick. The issue is that we now have the dogma of you have to prioritize, and it's always skewed towards strength. So you end up with people telling you, hey, ab isolation is a waste of time. You would be better off spending that time training your core. And they're correct if your goal is to have a bigger total. But for bodybuilding, you absolutely have to isolate your abs. I've been trying to get people to isolate their abs for the past 3 years, where I tell people, hey, it costs nothing. Ab isolation is free. 3 sets of crunches or flexions or windshield wipers at the end of your training is gratuitous. It's just there. You just do it, and that's it. And then after a while, you will get to see the results.
Yeah, we agree on that, where people tell you that you don't have to do isolations, you don't have to isolate your arms. My response to that is, why not? It's not going to hurt you. It's not going to affect your recovery. You're not going to get an injury from it. It doesn't make any sense. It really is just weird advice. And something that you've done a great job of pointing out on your channel is, why did so many strength focused and powerlifting focused people on social media feel so comfortable giving out all this hypertrophy advice? And I'm not here to name anybody or name drop in particular, but I think it's such a bad dogma that was kind of floating around, where you'd go anywhere, YouTube, Instagram, whatever, and everybody that's training for hypertrophy or aesthetics is following a powerlifting type program or a strength oriented program. And I eventually fell into that trap. So my question to you would be, when did you fall for that trap, and when did you break out of it?
So I think if I were to give you a date, it would be around 2016, because this is when I first stepped into like a real gym with barbells and all of the stuff that you need to do the power lifts. And when I did, I turned to YouTube for advice, and all of the advice I got was from powerlifting channels, but they never called themselves powerlifting channels. They called themselves fitness channels or like muscle-oriented channels. So I was like, all right, well, clearly this is what I need to do. And slowly but surely, I started training following their methods. And the thing that I've noticed with these guys is that they are very possessive with compound movements. So I'll still get people who take a look at my old training videos and are like, oh, so you're a powerlifter, because they see me benching. In their heads, they associate the action of benching with being a powerlifter, even though bodybuilders were benching before powerlifting was even a thing, right? These lifts are also ours. And at the end, they're just patterns. It's a pattern to activate the muscle, but I didn't know that back then. So between 2016 and I think 18, 19, this is when I was really stuck into that dogma. And then I broke out of it because the bubble popped and I looked at my body and I was like, all right, you're 240, your knee, lower back and ankles hurt from walking 15 minutes and you look horrible. What happened? Because on top of that, I wasn't even that strong. That's the worst part. I'm stronger now on most lifts than I was back then, looking tremendously better. So it was the worst of both worlds. I was a fat guy that was weak. You don't want to be that guy. So I did a suicide cut, which I don't recommend because I was panicking. And then I stabilized, all right, let's rebuild. Let's see what I did wrong, because clearly I did something right before. I went from 110 to 180 with lean mass in 5-6 years. And I had a pretty good physique before I did all of that nonsense. So let me see what I was doing back then and try to re-implement that. And it took me a long time to undo the brainwashing and to reconstruct a program and to then attain bodybuilding. And as I was doing that, once I was confident, I told myself, okay, if that happened to me, it happened to other people. So let me start a channel and let me see if I can get some people out of this. And I know to this day that I still have people that are stuck in that dogma and that are slowly waking up. But you'll still hear someone who will try to resist isolation by retorting that, oh, 3 sets of bicep curls is going to take away from my ability to bench. They're still thinking like a powerlifter. And even that mindset is not correct, because why would training your bicep impair your ability to bench? It makes no sense. I would conclude by saying that this is also why I push supersets so aggressively. It's because once you do supersets, it will make you realize that all of the things that you heard in the past was nonsense. You can superset your bench press with some forearms. It will not make you less performant. It will simply give you free volume. Free volume is everywhere. You just have to get it.
I'm with you there. The one thing that I've noticed is that I opened every upper body session with some type of horizontal press, so some movement for chest paired up with something for biceps. And then I have 2 vertical pulls later in the session on my upper days after training biceps, and even on a fatiguing bicep movement like an incline curl or something along the lines of that, where I can smoke my biceps with 4 sets right at muscular failure with a couple partials after, and then still have effective back training. So that's definitely a great point you're making there. And I think another thing is, even if you do these accessory isolation movements in a strength-oriented type program, if you don't have the right mindset, you're not going to approach it right. And that's something that I talked about before, where even if you're on paper, your program and your split looks good and a training session looks good, we tend to bias the bench press on the upper day. And then the bicep curls, they get tossed on at the end and they're completely half-assed. Oh, just 3x12 with 25-pound dumbbells. Don't worry about failure. Just do them. It doesn't matter. It's an easy isolation lift. And then you end up with what you would call that spider mode physique, which was me. I had a giant back, and I did isolate my lats and shoulders, not necessarily just through isolation lifts, but they had a lot of direct work where they were the prime movers and they had more volume, and I trained them harder. And I realized I had a spider mode physique like you talk about, but then I had these huge lats and I had these huge delts back when I was in power building. And for myself, that was that aha moment where I figured out what works and what doesn't. I think for you, it was when you said you were a fat guy and I was still weak, and that was the moment that clicked in your head. For me, it was like, oh, well, I had a good physique in certain ways, but I'm like, okay, so my delts, which are the toughest muscles for me to grow, started from probably the lowest point, have now turned into my strongest muscle group. But my overhead press is still garbage. It's still super weak. But I have done a ton of isolation work. And there's a few guys in my comments that keep hounding me to make a video on how I grew my delts. I'll probably, it's nothing too serious. It's kind of just the whole spam lateral raises meme. I'll touch on this at some point, but there was a foundation of what truly works to build muscle that was there. And maybe spamming lateral raises and band face pulls isn't the best way to go about it, but the volume, the effort, the proximity to failure, and making my delts a prime mover of a lift and isolating them, that's what led to the growth, training them with high frequency versus just doing whatever you can to get a stronger overhead press and build that up as much as I possibly can. So a more balanced approach where, I still did my vertical pressing, but it wasn't an all my eggs in one basket and then do accessory lifts after. That's not the best way to get big.
And I think you described it well when you say all the eggs in the one basket. It's something that I see with people who have a one-way approach to bodybuilding, where they say, okay, you want big shoulders, do this. But then the problem is that if you're a teacher or an educator, what if it doesn't work? Right? What if that advice doesn't work for 20% of the population? Many lifters, many YouTubers to that would say, oh, it's your fault. You didn't do it hard enough. It's not the method that's wrong, it's you. That is horrendous. That is not the way to teach people. And yet it's the majority of YouTubers, because we're at a point where when their theories doesn't reconcile with reality, they claim that reality doesn't exist or that it's a skewed reality. And it cannot work like this. And this is why also I think that looking at results instead of words and theories is more important. Some guy will tell you, oh, don't isolate your biceps, just do chin-ups. Don't isolate your triceps, just do bench. All right, that's a theory. Then you look at the reality of that guy's physique. He has no biceps, he has no triceps. Where do you go from there? Well, if you're smart, you reassess the theory based on that actual reality. Many people don't. Many people are deeply deluded about their physiques, well, they don't realize how imbalanced they are. And what's so funny too is that you also see that with performance. It's something that you pointed. You have people who will tell you, oh, pull-ups train your arms. They train your brachioradialis, so you don't have to isolate it. Okay, but how do you explain the fact that I can smoke my forearm and biceps before I do pull-ups and I can still perform on pull-ups as if I didn't do isolation before? That points out to the fact that the pull-up is a back exercise. It's logical, but once you experience it, it changes your world, because now you can train many more muscle groups. The issue with that idea of, oh, you absolutely don't want to train this because it will impair this, is that now you end up doing almost a powerlifting type bro split, or you do squats and then maybe some calves and leg extensions, but not too much of everything else, because you don't want the squat to suffer. Once you do supersets and you realize that actually the body is not that stupid and certain muscles do certain things, you can get many more done. Today, for example, on the schedule, I have some belt squat rows, and then I have some pullovers. The two work the lats. And some could tell me, okay, well, that's stupid, it's redundant. I have found that regardless of if I do the rows or not, the pullovers performance stays the same, because it's not the same pattern, and yet it's the same muscle. I'll get twice the volume with the same intensity and performance and no sacrifice. That's the way to go about it. That's the reality that then becomes the theory.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So you're saying you said it's a belt squat row?
Yep.
So you do a belt squat row and then you pair it up with pullovers. And
so I would actually not superset the two. I think that would be a mistake. I will push the pullover into the later giant set. So I do two giant sets today, 4 exercises. One for the lat will be the belt row, and then the second row of giant sets will be with a pullover for the lats.
Okay, so throughout the session, you're not seeing attrition in terms of performance. It's staying the same whether you train that, even if it's the same muscles, just it's a different movement. So you're still able to get more quality volume in.
Yep.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One thing you touched on earlier that caught my mind, and this is something that I enjoy to talk about a little bit, and that I like to point out basically, is I think you have these guys that they get so caught up in, I think they take pride in telling people to just stick to the basics, and you have to stick to the basics and just work hard, and anything, for some reason, anything outside of the basics just is you're training soft, and you're just half-assing your training. And this isn't, don't get this conflated, anyone that's watching this, by this isn't me saying that the basics don't work, because the basics work. The basics are the basics for a reason. But at the same time, I would have all these people say, and this is what I used to say. I got brainwashed into falling for this and then becoming one of them, where anybody that wasn't doing a low bar squat directly to parallel, and if someone was doing a hack squat instead, I would call the hack squat fluff and pump. But in reality, I'm calling myself out because it's a me issue. I'm projecting. There's nothing wrong with the hack squat. Arguably, the hack squat's more difficult than a low bar squat because you have to push it harder to failure, and you can safely do it, so you have no excuse not to. Versus a low bar squat, you can leave a couple reps in the tank and it's totally fine, and you'll still get the benefit versus going all the way to failure, which is arguably detrimental for that lift. But for myself, there is this bodybuilder that was doing them, he wasn't natural, and that's besides the point. But he's way more jacked than me, obviously. Whether he was natural or not, I still think he'd be more jacked than me because his training methods were better than mine. But I would mock this guy because he trained the hack squat. And I said, oh, he's afraid to work hard. He's just doing the hack squat so he doesn't have to get under a barbell. And I would put myself as the superior because I had balls to go to a barbell squat and have to do this big, tough guy movement. When in reality, his quads were twice the size of mine. Even if he was natural, they'd probably be 1.5 times the size of mine, because he would get in the hack squat, push that thing all the way to failure. When I did the hack squat, it was easy because I called it an accessory lift and I would half-ass it. So yes, at that point, the hack squat is an accessory lift when you have that mindset. My bicep curls, oh, it's a stupid little isolation lift. It doesn't mean anything. It's not doing anything. It's easy. I don't really feel it. No, my mindset going into it's wrong. So I'm half-assing it. I'm looking off in the corner, thinking about doing low bar squats when I'm curling or doing hack squats. That's why the movement doesn't give you anything. One of the first things I did when I broke out of this dogmatic way of thinking that I think we both talked about falling for earlier is I went cold turkey on compound barbell lifts, not because there's something entirely wrong with them, but because I had to break my mindset. So I had to find a way to relearn how to leg press and hack squat and actually push them hard. And now I'm realizing these movements are great. It was me that was just doing them wrong because I would treat it as an accessory. I would always do it later in the workout, and I didn't have the right mindset going into it. So now when I do, say, a Smith machine hack squat on the Smith machine in front of me, it's intimidating to go into each set because of how hard it hurts. And yeah, I could call it an accessory and half-ass it, but who's the tougher guy here? The guy that does the compound lift and stays a couple reps shy of failure, that has a lot of strength in that movement, or the guy that's willing to go all in on a Smith machine hack squat, drop his ego and go to like muscular failure where you can barely breathe and you're in physical pain, but your quads are twice as big. Who's the real tough guy here?
It's so interesting because psychologically, it fascinates me because it's a form of anti-tryhards that claim to be the tryhards. Their goal is to look as hardcore as possible. But all of this is for their own sake. It's for their own ego. And you see that a lot with the barber supremacists. People say, oh, if you don't do a squat with a barbell, you're not really squatting. If you don't go to parallel or below, you're not really squatting. And the question I have is, who is saying that and who is judging? Why exactly did you get to decide that this was the golden standard? Because reality doesn't corroborate that at all. And I would go even as far as to say that it's a thing that you pointed out. It is much easier to do 1 to 2 sets of barbell back squats to failure than it is to do 4 sets of hack squats to failure and then more movements for the legs. One is more painful than the other. And I think that for a lot of these guys, I would call them soft. They like to call the people soft, but they actually hide behind practices that look tough, but aren't actually tough. It's all theatrics and it doesn't get results. That's my biggest problem. If it did get results, I would be fine. I would be on board with them, but it doesn't. And anyone who has had that shift in mindset between, compounds with barbells all the time to push everything to failure all the time using movements that actually target the muscle knows this. Personally, between doing 3 sets of post squats to failure and 3 sets of split squats to failure, I would always pick the post squats because they're so much easier. Split squats are a torture because the only thing that's working is the target muscle. So if you go to failure, yeah, your legs are going to be screaming, you're going to be out of breath, you will want to stop. And anecdote, just recently, I saw a post from a guy who was clowning split squats saying, oh, I see all of these guys who say split squats are so tough, they're such pussies. Then I saw the way he was doing split squats. I shit you not, he was bending his knee that much and he was using 3 plates. I was like, all right, so you managed to take a lift that's actually hard and you modified it to make it look hard, but make it very easy instead. No duh, you think split squats are easy. You're not doing split squats. You're doing a powerlifting version of the split squat that does nothing. So this is the true difference. A bodybuilder will take everything to failure using the lift that is not necessarily the most painful. It's not about sensation, but that will be the most damaging to the muscle. Once you have that mindset, yeah, every single set will count. You won't just do squats and then the rest is fluff and pump, whatever that means. Everything matters. And I think that this is also un déclic, as we say in French. It's a realization at some point where you're like, okay, I've been doing curls for 3 years, I've seen no result. Now I start taking the curls and treating them like a priority and I train them intensely, and magically the muscle starts to grow again because it's challenged. Once again, not going to cite names, I used to remember a guy on YouTube Fitness who used to claim that it was impossible to train the bicep intensely because it's a small muscle. And to that I say, you've never trained biceps in your life. I can show you footage of me doing bicep curls with an easy bar where I look like I'm going to pass out because I'm squeezing every last ounce of energy in my body and I go to true failure. Unsurprisingly, people who train like this get results, and the people who don't.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I've seen those old clips of you doing the easy bar curls too. I think, yeah, because you did full reps and you've done partials, right? Top half partials. I think, yeah, I remember seeing one where, yeah, I was like, that guy, he knows what he's talking about, because you can see when you're someone like me or you have an eye for people that train properly and that train isolation lifts hard. And that's one thing that I've learned is when you actually pay attention, like that split squat example you made where he's like, oh, split squats are easy, and proceeds to make them easy, but somehow makes them look like they're difficult. Anyone that knows that they're easy because the range of motion is so small. But you have an eye for people that train isolation lifts hard or train isolation lifts in a way that would make them an accessory lift. But just because you're getting accessory type results from them doesn't mean an accessory lift. It's an accessory lift. You just have to find a way to actually train it properly and train it hard. And that's where I think RPE and RIR almost get pushed out there a little bit too much, where people say, all right, well, every lift train to 1 RIR. That works for some lifts, but for a lot of lifts, you have to take it right to failure. Or even you have to stop looking at every lift under the light of technical failure. Because when you look at an isolation lift, a lot of the times technical failure is just kind of the start of getting that lift to be tough. Something like a lateral raise. I'm not just like, oh, I didn't quite get up all the way, so that's failure. I do some partials, maybe some cheat reps, and find a way to make that a little bit more difficult. So when it comes to like you doing your isolation lifts, I know with your compound lifts, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure you use RIR and you have, whether it's to 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. I think you have a way of doing that. You can correct me if I'm wrong for sure, but when it comes to isolation lifts, like what's your mindset going into those?
So I always think in terms of risk and reward, because to me, that's why you do our rest and reserve. Right? There's absolutely no point in shaving off reps at the end of the set where they're the most intense and therefore the most efficient if you don't have a solid reasoning behind it. So I'll always do between 2 and 1 reps in reserve for compound movements that I believe could potentially be dangerous if I did not do this. Example, good mornings. A good morning is always reps in reserve 2. I stop shy of 2 reps before failure, because I believe that even though these last 2 reps would be very beneficial for intensity and hypertrophy, they're not worth the risk. So I cut them off. Something like an RDL, I do 1 rep in reserve, because I know that the last rep might be something where I use too much quads, or I start rounding the upper back, and it's something that I don't want. So even though it's a very intense rep, I don't do it. And then you have the bench. What could happen to me if I took the bench to failure? Worst case scenario, it slams on the safeties. So 0 reps in reserve. I go to actual failure. I go until the rep where I know for a fact there is no way I'm getting another one, and I stop there. And after that, we talk about isolations. Isolations are all the way on the other side of the spectrum. It's almost impossible to get hurt on isolation if you control the range of motion and if you know what you're doing. So for isolation, I do the opposite. I do negative reps in reserve. I always go to failure. And then once at failure, I think, okay, is there a way for me to get more? With an easy bar curl, there is. I get an extra negative. So that's more work. And then if I do a preacher curl, I might get to failure and just wait. I'll wait 20 seconds and I'll just focus on my reps and on my breathing, and then I'll do it again. And I might get 2, 3, 4 additional reps. That's extra reps after failure. Technically, I rested, but it's still extra work and it's free. If it's free and it's there, take it. If you don't push your isolations to failure safely, and you don't always try and find a way to squeeze additional reps, you're leaving gains on the table.
I agree. I like that negative RIR viewpoint too, where failure's it's the minimum standard. You have to find ways to either go above it. Yeah, whether it's an advanced technique, partials, rest pause, stuff like this. I think it all has its value, and that makes a ton of sense. I really like the way you put that. One other topic I want to dive into a little bit is, and I think this will be interesting because I think one of the things that you talk about, it's a little bit more philosophical rather than training, is identity. And I think you've made a couple different videos on that. And to me, that's one of the most interesting things, where you see a lot of like self-improvement stuff that comes down to making these little habits that will probably make you a little bit more of a more productive or better person or whatever. But I think a lot of the time we're missing the whole like building your character and truly building up your identity and who you want to be in a lot of that self-improvement type stuff. And I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but when it comes to training enjoyment, I recently made a video called Hot Take, Enjoying Your Training is Overrated. And I still believe that, definitely, but I did get a comment that was super interesting, where I think he definitely challenged my viewpoint. So I posted that video probably 5, 6, 7 days ago. And I think most people kind of disagreed to an extent. Some people actually agreed, which I was kind of shocked about. But one guy left a comment and he said, okay, so if we find out that like a stretch mediated hypertrophy is all you need for growth and it is 1% better than lifting itself, would you do it? If you just had to lock yourself in a stretch, each muscle was just locked in a stretch for an hour a day, and you got the exact results you would have from lifting except 1% better, would you do it? And I think that made me think a little bit more about lifting and how it's almost at this point formed into part of my identity, which I think any serious lifter has. And I think that's a good thing. So yeah, when I first started lifting, all I cared about was the results. So I'd go in, do whatever I needed to do. I don't care if I liked it or not, because my enjoyment was dictated by the results that I got. So if I thought a lift wouldn't give me results, but I thought it looked cool, I wouldn't like it anymore because it wouldn't give me results. Versus if a lift looked really difficult and hard and I didn't see the point in it, but it gave me awesome results, now I love the lift. So this question made me think, okay, well, at this point, after grinding out a few years in the gym and building muscle, I'm starting to, I don't want to say enjoy lifting, but you build an identity around lifting itself. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this one.
I think that to start, I would like to introduce the proverb that everyone has heard a million times, but that people don't apply in their life. And that is that what matters most is not the destination, it's the journey. I knew that when I got started, because when I got started, I wanted an outlet. I wanted something to put my energy in. I was not in a good place in my life, and I wanted to change who I was. So I started to lift. And at first, it was for the results. I wanted a bigger body. But before I knew it, it had become a ritual where I would come home from school, I would lift, do my homework, eat with my family, and that was my life. And this is what built my identity. It was an anchor at the center of my universe where it was a constant. I knew that this was solid. If I could do this for the rest of my life, then I could build around it. This was the best gains of my life. It was the first portion of my lifting journey because I did not care that much about the results. It was all about the process. Then I discovered YouTube Fitness. I discovered powerlifting. I discovered compound movements, and I discovered numbers. And my mindset shifted from oh, I'm enjoying what I'm doing and I want to do it for the rest of my life, to I have this period of time where I'm young to get as strong and big as possible. So let's get after it and look at the results and hyper focus on the numbers. And just like that, my love for lifting evaporated. I was still doing it out of discipline because that's what I'd always done. It was part of my life. It was still that anchor, but now it had become a negative thing, where all of the bad aspects of my life sort of started to stick around it. And I see many people like this. We have a gym culture nowadays. Many people go to the gym. It's big on Instagram. And you could think, well, that's a positive. I disagree, because I think that most people apply this to their life and are part of the culture for the wrong reasons. They are not doing it because it's going to benefit them. They're doing it either because other people are doing it, or because they think it's going to make them more popular with the ladies. It's going to fix their insecurities. And it very well could. It absolutely could. But once you get that done, then what? Are you going to stop lifting? Are you going to let it stall? I personally don't want to be the guy who in 5 years has quit bodybuilding. I don't want to be the guy who has fallen out of love with bodybuilding, because I see that too often. The dude that is fine with maintaining. You can't do that. To me, that's the death of the spirit as a man. So this is what was happening to me. I was on a downward trajectory, and eventually it got so bad that I had to make a choice. Either you quit lifting or you relearn how to love it. And I've started to relearn how to love it. And now I'm at a point where, frankly, the results don't matter. If tomorrow I stopped progressing entirely, my physique stagnated, and I got the same lifts with no increments, I would still lift, because the action of lifting is therapeutic to me. It's my ritual. And I would say, not necessarily paradoxically, but logically in this case, this is now the period of my training time where the results come the easiest, and I don't have to force them. I don't have to like try to force the muscle to grow. I don't have to push like a madman to get results. I do what I love with intensity and passion, the way you're supposed to do it, and it just happens. So I think that there is a truth in the fact that pursuing happiness and pleasure in the gym and doing what you like is not necessarily a good idea. But if you can get to a point where you can do what you like and what you enjoy and see the results, then you're doing things properly. And now it's a certitude that you will be lifting forever. And one more thing about the fun aspect of training too is that the example you gave is interesting, because yeah, what if you could get better results just being strapped in a chair and doing nothing every single day, and you'll get bigger that way? I think that on paper, it looks like it would be the smart choice, because if you only care about results, you'll get more that way. But then there's also the problem of adherence. Many of us, we live because we enjoy it. And this enjoyment makes us go back into the gym every day, which then correlates with results. I guarantee you that even if you could get, let's say, like 20% better gains, just sitting there doing nothing, most people would never stick to that method at all. And that, I think, points us to the fact that it's not really the results that we're after. It's something deeper than that. And I would be bold here and connect that to the topic of steroids. Many people start steroids because they think, oh, if I get those results, I'll be happy. But they're never happy, because it was never the muscle size they were after. It was something deeper, something spiritual. And I think that PEDs sever that relationship. It cuts you from that identity you could have developed via lifting, because now you're cheating your way to get results, which leads to you getting the type of result that just makes your life worse and not actually better.
You took the words out of my mouth. I was going to make the same comparison. So yeah, I definitely think we think in similar ways with this kind of stuff. So it is interesting to hear your ideas here. When it comes to PEDs, I'm 100% with you. And health downsides aside, and all the hormones and whatnot, put all that to the side. I think even if steroids were perfectly healthy and they didn't alter a whole ton of stuff with your physiology and whatnot, it's earning the gains that truly makes you appreciate them more. And I think if you compare that to something, say like the lottery, where say you win the lottery and you compare that to a cycle of PEDs, it's crazy and it's overwhelming at first, but you realize you didn't earn it. You're kind of just lucky and you almost feel out of place there. And obviously I've never taken PEDs, so I wouldn't know that, but I can make a pretty solid educated guess on how that would probably feel. And when you don't earn those gains, you feel out of place having them. And I think for myself, the pride that I take in my physique and in lifting it's from putting in the hard work to actually earn it. And that's the representation of it. And that's why a good physique has value. It's because it's not easy, and it takes that hard work and getting kind of out of your comfort zone, as corny as that sounds, to achieve. And then at the end of the day, the reason you wanted a physique is because it has value. And the value is not from the muscle itself. It's not from the result. It's from how you get there. So as great as the result is, it's earning the result. It's the journey, and it's the process, like you said, that gives that result the value itself.
And this is why PD users are very upset with us now, because the natural community is rebuilding a pride and they don't like it. And a lot of the time when they don't like it, they try to point us as being the insecure ones. Oh, you're not man enough to take drugs. It's a projection.
Yeah.
They're the ones with no pride, because there is no pride in taking drugs. Deep down, you will always know that it's the drugs, because if you get off the drugs, all of that muscle disappears. This is horrible, because it means that, well, not only did you not earn those muscles, so they were never really yours, any type of innate value that would have come with the building of the muscle is not even there, which is why I've always found that for PD users, when I see some of them being confident or having that bravado or machismo about them, I see it as fake. I see it as the drugs talking. And I'm like, I wonder how you would sound without all of your hormones, because I'm sure as hell you would not be as confident.
Yeah, it's weird to think about. And I know who you're referencing, because I saw your video, and I've seen this guy's video too, or at least I know who you might have in mind when you're talking about that. It's interesting because when it comes to, when you see the correlation between the character that you develop and the identity you develop and the results that you get, you can start to see that those PD users, they have a beginner understanding of training. They also have a beginner level character that they've built from training, which I think is super interesting. And I think that almost proves that point. And this isn't to say all PED users are just complete beginners and the drugs do all the work, because of course there are guys that work hard and take PEDs, and that's a different story. Not entirely, but that's not exactly what I'm talking about here. But I think that's an interesting correlation. And as I've advanced in natural lifting and bodybuilding, one thing I'm realizing is that you can tell who takes PEDs and is still a beginner when they're training. In one of my more recent videos, actually it was my most recent one, my training log, I'm not sure if you saw it, but I was talking about how you should look ugly when you train. That exact day, I go on my Instagram, on my explore page or whatever, I see this post of this guy, I'm not going to name his name, clearly on gear, and he's just doing all these obscure lifts, which is fine. It's okay to do things that aren't the basics. It's totally fine, like I was mentioning earlier. But his face is just perfect, like perfectly modeled, still doing all these lifts, and then he just stops before they're even hard. That's a beginner. And that false sense of bravado, that big kind of like masculine type image or persona that these guys try and give off, you can see right through it. And anybody that's an intermediate or advanced natural lifter, you can see right through it. And that's where I think intermediate advanced natural bodybuilders are probably the least likely to want to go down the road of taking PEDs, because they can see right through it. And that's an interesting point that you make. And that correlation is pretty interesting in my mind.
The difference in behavior is shocking, but it's also the fact that there is this idea in a lot of people's minds that every single PED user got to a natural level that is elite, then jumped on drugs, which makes them, in a sense, relevant. You can still take advice from them. That's like maybe 2% of PED users. The majority of them, they started drugs within 1 or 2 years when they were still complete noobs. And unsurprisingly, after 5 years of PED use, their knowledge never went anywhere, because the drugs do everything for them. You don't have to learn how to train if you get bigger by upping the dose. But then these very same guys, they have the appearance of knowledge because they're big, which is very appealing to people who don't know what anything is. And so they end up becoming authority figures. Then you wonder why you have so many young lifters who are black-pilled and they say, oh, it's impossible to get big naturally. You're taking advice from someone who was never big naturally. And it's horrible too, because it creates a cycle of drug use. Because these same guys then think, well, Clearly, the only way to get big is to take drugs. So let me jump on drugs. And this guy becomes another golem that is going to then push that same type of message. And it's that very childishness of PD users that I like to point out, because it really reveals them for the ridiculous people that they are. These are not strong, solid, confident, masculine men. They're the exact opposite. They're toddlers. They have a very low confidence. And you can see it because when you point out their use, they get upset, even though they know that's where the results come from for the most part. So all of this connects then back also to the analogy you made about the lottery. An interesting thing about people who win the lottery is that the vast majority of them end up bankrupt within 2 years because you never earned that money. So it has no meaning to you. Look at PD users. The majority of these guys will end up dropping out of lifting once they stop using the drugs, or they will meet a horrible fate very quickly and very fast. Whereas us naturals, not only do we earn the gains, we keep the gains, because what you got naturally, you can keep naturally forever.
Agreed. And you appreciate them too. I think that's the biggest thing. Yeah, it is interesting being someone that, and I know we've both done this, where we both started as a beginner, obviously, and you come up through it, you see these PED guys, and you think they know everything because they frame themselves to act like they know everything. How many times have you heard, yeah, steroids, you take them, I hit my natural limit and took steroids, it's the icing on the cake. You look back and you find out when these guys started taking this gear, well before any type of natural limit that these guys are claiming, and it's certainly not the icing on the cake. So that's an interesting one. And I think you had a video a while back, steroids make you stupid, and of course the title is obviously pretty extreme, and it's which I think is cool. I've been doing those kinds of titles lately because you know that your video isn't just some clickbait thing, you actually have valid points behind it. But when you're talking about you losing the ability or the need to actually learn how to properly program in your training, it's a pretty valid point. And that's one video where I was like, steroids make you stupid. Like, what's this video going to be? This doesn't make a whole ton of sense. And then you're like, oh, okay. And that's when it kind of clicked in my head, like, interesting. Yeah, these guys really don't have to do much. And I've seen that firsthand too, where I've seen the non-natural lifters in the commercial gyms that are on gear and they're just doing whatever with their training and they somehow magically have these results. I remember seeing this one guy. It's funny because his legs looked like he didn't even lift, but then he just go over and bench 275 for like sets of 12 and just had this massive chest. That's a side tangent there, but just the strangest thing where I'm like, yeah, well, you can do whatever you want. Just go do bench, do whatever, stay shy of failure, still blow up your chest entirely. But yeah, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on, yeah, steroids making you stupid and how you don't learn how to program properly from not having to learn it naturally.
So I have a good analogy for this, but before that, I want to rebound on what you just said, because I think that we've all, if you've been to a commercial gym, you've been around PD users. They're fairly easy to recognize. They look like lobsters, they're red in the face all the time, and they do nothing. That's sort of their defining trait. The laziest lifters I've ever seen in my life are the PD users, which contradicts the notion on YouTube Fitness that they're the ones who work the hardest. You hear that all the time. Oh yeah, I take drugs, but it just helps me recover. I work harder than you. Nonsense. I've been around these guys. They sit on their ass, they do 3 sets of curls, they send back their bench and they go home. And yet they're bigger than me, they're bigger than you, they're bigger than every single natural. The icing of the cake mathematically makes no sense, because if you look at the top level natural, we're talking top level, the guy might step on stage at 180, 190 lean. Look at the top level pro bodybuilders. They're 270 lean. It's almost 100 pounds of lean mass difference. Icing of the cake, that's the whole cake. It's the entire thing. Without drugs, pro bodybuilding does not exist. And then this leads us back onto the notion that these guys really should not be giving advice. It would be the same thing as taking advice from someone who is a very good chess player, but who cheats, who uses an engine. I played chess for a long time. I knew guys like this. These dudes were very good because the engine was telling them what move to make at what time. But if you tell them, hey, why did you move your pawn here? Why did you move the king? Why is your queen here? They'd be like, instinct. Sure, instinct. All right. So you found the top level engine move by instinct. No, it's that these guys were cheating. But the problem is that if this guy wants to cheat, it's fine, it's his life. But then if he goes on to give advice, he's going to be a horrible teacher. He doesn't know why he does things. He cannot teach other people. I would even go as far as to say that this also applies to people with top level genetics, because it's the same. If everything comes easy to you, you don't know what works. In the complete opposite, however, people who've struggled to get the gain, someone who's a bad chess player and who learned through strategy and theory, that guy can teach you a heck of a lot of things. And for natural lifters, I think that's the way, that's the path. We failed all the time, we made the mistakes, and now we can come and we can correct that. And we correct that because we always have our eyes on the variables: volume, intensity, progressively overloading, technique, range of motion. All of this we have to pay attention to, because if we don't, we regress or we stagnate. The PD user doesn't have to do that. He just has to up the dose. So naturally, these guys should be pushed away from us. I'm not there to tell them not to do that, it's their body. But however, I'm there to say that they don't belong in this community, because the only thing they do is they hurt us.
And that's where you get all these things, all these pieces of advice, like just lift, just get stronger. Yeah, some people can get away with that and get big and be a successful lifter from that. When I took that advice, it was awful. It didn't work. And that's why I have my channel now. And I think me and you are both in the same boat, where I mean, I don't care if my genetics are good or bad, because anybody that learns the true value of natural bodybuilding, at that point, it just doesn't matter. But I guess for myself, when I took that advice, like just get stronger, just lift, it doesn't matter, stop worrying about it. I still get these comments all the time, like, why do you worry about all the small details? I'm like, well, if I don't, then my results, they stop. Like I have to have everything set up properly. I'm not some genetic freak has this big following on Instagram, and then my followers are like, oh, well, how do I do this? And you're like, oh, it doesn't matter, just lift, just train hard and eat chicken. It's like, well, no, it's a little more complex than that. So I think if you're someone like me or you that, like, I don't know what your genetics are, but I know mine are average. I'm a normal guy. I had to learn how to do things properly, because the simple methods that some of these guys use that do have great genetics, or that took gear, where they're like, it doesn't matter, just lift, just do the basics and don't think about it much. It doesn't work for everybody. And it took me a while to realize that. And at this point now it's funny because people in the comments will say, oh, I have great genetics. So someone will make a comment like, your shoulders are incredible. How do you get these big shoulders? And someone will reply and they'll say, oh, well, he just has good genetics. That is not true. That is completely not the case at all. So I'm curious if you've ever had a situation like that, because I know you have your philosophy about, is it Schrodinger's genetics or Schrodinger's genetics? That's a super interesting one, where you have bad genetics. So, or say your genetics are average. If you fail, it's because you had bad genetics. But if you succeed, it's because your genetics turned out to be good. But they won't tell you what your genetics are until you either succeed or fail. I think that's a great point you make.
Yeah, it's very disingenuous, but it's people who have their viewpoint of life. They've been told that it's all about genetics, so that's the only thing they can think of. Their perspective starts there. So if someone succeeds, genetics. If someone fails, genetics. It's a fatalistic approach to life, a very dangerous one at that, but I understand why these people are like this. Again, it's PD users. PD users promoted that mindset because it takes the eye and it misdirects away from their use. Or they can claim, well, yeah, sure, I take drugs, but you could take the same drugs and not look like me. It's my genetics. They do that because it makes them feel superior. And it also, in a sense, gives them a sense of superiority that they like, because they lack ego, they lack confidence. So they need it from somewhere. But as always, what they do is they project that onto us. So they project their shitty methods onto us, and then they project their shitty mindsets onto us, and it poisons the natural community. Because I guarantee you that the guy that leaves the comments saying, oh, he has big shoulders because he has good genetics, what he's really saying is, it does not matter how much I train or the methods I espouse, I will always have small shoulders because I have bad genetics. It's all a long list of justifications that people feed themselves to feel better. I'm at a point where I'm not an old sage or a wisdom guy. I'm still in my 30s, so I'm not that old. But I've come to realize that the vast majority of people would rather feel better about themselves than become a better person, because it takes less effort and it's more immediate.
Yeah.
To realize your shortcomings and to realize that it is all on you hurts. It's tough, but it's the first step towards actually becoming a better person. And it starts with stop not caring anymore about genetics. It does not matter what genetics you are. This is the hand you've been given. Play with it. If you just refuse to play, or if you fall right away because you say, well, I will never win, then sure, you will never win. You just fulfilled the prophecy of your own defeat. That's Schrodinger's genetics. It's also up to you. If you refuse to enter the box, well, you'll never come out of the box jacked. You'll stay skinny for the rest of your life.
Yeah. It's another interesting point where I agree with you, where I think it's a mental justification to avoid doing the hard work that it takes to get there. And that's putting it very simply. But I think in the culture that we have nowadays, and this isn't just to say, like, I hate these people that say, oh, modern society is completely doomed and we're completely screwed. I'm not an extremist, but you do see it pretty regularly where people will go so far out of their way to justify shortcomings that are within their control. So I think the best example with lifting is the whole bad genetics thing, where, yeah, like people will say, I have bad genetics and so I can't do this, or I'll never be able to look like this. But in reality, we're talking bodybuilding genetics. We're not talking about your height. Your ability to put on muscle is well within your control. And of course, genetics are still a factor, but in the big picture, not really. When you look at something like height, like what can you can't boost your height. So yes, learning to accept what you're at for height, that's a good thing. But when it comes to bodybuilding genetics, let's stop there, because that is much more within your control. And even beyond that, one thing that I want to go a little bit further into is most people that are in this lifting community were hypertrophy enthusiasts rather than competitive bodybuilders. And one thing that I haven't really seen anyone talk about and this is something that I've realized over the years, is that your genetics matter more on a bodybuilding stage. Like, sure, you're a short bicep or wider hips or whatever the judge doesn't like, that matters more at the top levels of a bodybuilding stage when you have no fat on your body. But in day-to-day life, in terms of results, you're in a relaxed state. You can't tell if someone has a short bicep muscle belly or a long bicep muscle belly. All that matters is just the amount of mass that's there. The width of your hips or the width of your shoulders, maybe your shoulders a little bit, but these little genetic things that people get so caught up in, you don't notice it in a relaxed state that much. So I think just if this bicep was torn and it was a super short little head and this bicep attached all the way down at my elbow, when I do a front double bicep pose on a bodybuilding stage, sure, I think that makes a big difference. But in my relaxed day-to-day life, when I'm just sitting here with a relaxed physique, you're not going to see that much of a difference. So that's where I think genetics starts to become a little bit overrated, especially for just hypertrophy enthusiasts rather than like pro competitive natural bodybuilders.
It's a case of the exception becoming the rules, because a lot of what we do as bodybuilders for some reason is supposed to fall in line with the guidelines of pro bodybuilding. And I've never understood why this made sense. It doesn't make sense to start with, because the guidelines that we follow are PD users guidelines. So all of these diktats about leanness, about you have to be this, you have to be that. Well, I'm not taking the plug that this guy is taking, so I'm sure as I'm not going to follow what he does. And on top of that, it might also be that not everyone wants to be that. But when I say I'm a natural bodybuilder, at no point do I mean that I step on stage, because that's not what bodybuilding is. Unlike powerlifting, to me, if you're a powerlifter, powerlifting is a competitive sport that's based on performance. So this means that you are able to follow and accomplish a performative act, squatting, benching, deadlifting. You could be a non-competitive powerlifter. That is possible, but the act of being a powerlifter includes the idea of competition, not bodybuilding. Bodybuilding at the start in its infancy was one guy who shows up to a stage with no pump, no tan. He takes off his shirt and he flexes for people. That was bodybuilding. Then it started becoming a competition for the money, because that's what the money is. But beyond that, you can still call yourself a bodybuilder if you don't compete, because it's a state of existence. It's in the name, bodybuilding. If your goal in the gym is to build the body, guess what? You're a bodybuilder. You can be 130 pounds and be skinny, you're a mediocre bodybuilder, you're still a bodybuilder. And I would highly encourage people to not let others decide your identity for you. I've had people tell me, hey, you can't call yourself a bodybuilder because you don't compete. My answer is, who's going to make me? I'm a bodybuilder. You can't stop that. It's my identity, and this is what I do in the gym. I want us collectively to reclaim this, because I think it would lead to healthier approaches to identity, but also to methods, to training methods.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, I think one thing that you've done a great job of is reviving more of a hypertrophy purist mindset. And that's something that I have aimed to do on my channel as well. There's a time I started the channel a year ago, about 13 months ago, actually. And part of the reason why I wanted to do it was, well, one, I had these kind of, I don't want to say like unique or special training philosophies, but there were some things that weren't getting talked about that I did want to put my 2 cents in for. But part of it was, I saw channels like yours. I saw channels like Alpha Destiny, who I've been watching basically since I started lifting. Channels like this, where I'm like, you know what? Like, I'm such a huge advocate of natural bodybuilding, and it's changed my life entirely for the better. What am I doing not putting my voice out there and putting these ideas out there in helping people, but also just being another figure in the community and building the community even more? Like, I think that's something I think it's super important. And yeah, to see other channels out there doing that, I think it's great. And I think rebuilding natural bodybuilding is huge, because like you said, like it pretty much died. And I think you had a video called, it was like natural bodybuilding is dead, but we can revive it. I don't remember exactly what you talked about in that video, but at that point I was like, you know what, like, yeah, this is cool. And it's cool to kind of like have this sense of community back, because it was a little bit lonely before. Like, yeah, I didn't really stop lifting. Like, I was still just, I always would have been natural bodybuilding, or at least being a hypertrophy enthusiast naturally. But to rebuild that community and to actually advance other people and get these beginners that are confused up to that next level, and to help those intermediates like myself a few years ago, when I was completely stuck not knowing how to train because I was following either PED programs or mostly people that were just genetic freaks doing whatever they wanted to, and I wasn't getting the same results. To be able to help those people and kind of build up that community and just have more, I guess, more like role models. And I'm not saying like I'm a perfect role model, I should be a role model for everybody, but I'm the person that myself, when I was 18, 19, 20, would have wanted to see. And I think that's important. I think you do kind of the same thing on your channel for sure.
To me, this is the healthiest approach to content creation. It's to be the change you want to see in the world. So you see a vacuum for knowledge, you're like, hey, I can fill that. I can be the guy who speaks on this. And with trends and with cultures in general, what you notice with humans is that most people can only follow a practice if they see an example of it. So until they see something that is possible, they will not think it's possible. But once it's possible, they will pretend it has always been. That's my big thing with the natural limit.
Yeah.
I want to prove people with my own body that there's no such thing as a natural limit, because I know for a fact that the second I do, people are going to just do away with that entirely. And I think it's already happened. I made a video 2 years ago saying that the natural limit didn't exist. And back then there was a lot of resistance because people took it as a concept that was cemented. Yes, there is a natural limit, even though there was no proof whatsoever. I offered some argument and I was like, hey, watch me. I will progress as someone who's quote unquote advanced, and I'll show to you that there's no natural limit. And I think that now we are in a zeitgeist on YouTube Fitness where a lot of people are walking with this inner mindset and notion of there is no natural limit. It's like there's never been a natural limit, even though anyone who's been on YouTube Fitness knows that this was a thing, but just like that, it vanished through example. And I'll connect back to something that you said earlier that was very interesting, where you spoke about modernity and people who say, oh, we're doomed and we're decadent, etc., etc. I agree that this is a poor mindset, because what they don't realize is that what they feel, this pressure that they feel and this despair, comes from demoralization. We are facing peak demoralization right now, where you're told nothing is possible, nothing is your fault. We are doomed by a system that is trying to take away our personal responsibility for its own benefits. I won't get into that because it's a completely different discussion, but on YouTube Fitness, you see it as well. It's on you to not be demoralized, and it's on us to give people examples of high moral and of high expectations, because this is how you fix things.
I agree. And that's where I think being able to do what you innately want to do and not getting brainwashed into that black pilled culture, which is the trap that I fell for. I started lifting and I was the furthest thing from demoralized, and I was doing the methods that I thought would work. I didn't follow anybody else, and I got great results because I wanted the results and I found what worked. And like I said at the start of this podcast, is so that stuff, it turned out to be 75% right. Obviously, it wasn't perfect, but like I said, there was pillars of what I was doing when I first started before I followed anybody. It worked pretty well. And of course, things have had to be refined. And maybe I didn't understand why it worked back then, but a lot of that is closely tied to the conclusions that I've come to today. And it wasn't until I started following these like nihilistic black pilled lifters and people in YouTube fitness around 2016, 17, 18, whatever, that I became a little bit more demoralized with my training, where I became a clone. Like I saw these guys, you see all these Gymshark athletes, they all train the same way, talk the same way, film the same way, YouTube videos titled all the same way, chasing the same physique, the same poses. And then you slowly just, as an impressionable 18, 17, 19-year-old, whatever kid, I slowly became a clone, and I was wearing their clothes and I was following their programs. And then eventually I was like some Gymshark wearing power builder with a spider mode physique. And I had this wake up call where I'm like, what just happened? Like, I dread going to the gym. My identity is of somebody else. And I've completely lost building up myself as an individual. That was why I started lifting in the first place. And like we talked about earlier, you start lifting to see the value of the results. It's not for the results themselves. It's not to just copy and paste an identity from someone else, or to win the lottery, aka take steroids and just have these results handed to you, but it's to build yourself as an individual through lifting. And I think that's one of the more important things that you've talked about that a lot of people need to hear, because there was another guy I used to follow back when I was around 2021, when I kind of broke out of that whole like clone type thing where I was just kind of being like everybody else and chasing the same thing. And that gave me a wake up call. And then you've talked about that too. And I'm like, yeah, 100% I agree with this stuff.
And the earlier the wake up call occurs, the better, because I know people, and it's outside of fitness, it's everywhere, who have been following other people's opinions, other people's lifestyles, and chasing other people's goals for so long that when they finally realize that none of that matters to them, it's already too late. And it's what we call a midlife crisis. It's especially prevalent with men in their 30s or 40s who wake up and are like, what am I doing with my life? I've been working a job I hate. I have a family with people I don't like. None of the things I do I enjoy. Why am I still here? And all of that could have been avoided if they just had an identity to start with. It's getting tougher and tougher because the identity is built mostly throughout your teenage years. But your teenage years is also the part of your life where you are preyed upon the most intensely by people who benefit from taking you and turning you into a clone. Because something to keep in mind is that when you chase someone else's dreams, goals, and you have the same identity as them, you're working for them. You're essentially their employee. You buy their products and you consume their content. They own you. And until you can push that back and have your own identity, you cannot call yourself free. And I would even go as far as to say, you cannot call yourself a human. You're something else. You're a slave. You're a slave to someone else. Break those chains early, because if you wait, you might find out that once the chains are off, you won't know what to do with your freedom anymore.
Yeah, I'm with you there. And I think the answer is right in front of us too. If you want to build a strong identity and be able to think for yourself and to truly understand yourself more, I think the way to do it is through natural bodybuilding. And the beginners won't understand that because you haven't experienced it. But for someone like myself, where I'm not saying I'm some pro advanced bodybuilder or anything, but I've been doing it long enough and I've made enough gains where it's more than just the gains. It's the self mastery. You slowly, you're almost going into, I don't want to say uncharted territory, but you're at a level of discipline, hard work, learning, programming, and lifting methods that not everybody has done, or at least the people that you're surrounded by. And that's where you truly realize, that's where you truly build confidence, by doing these things that other people aren't willing to do and earning those actual results. And then the gains that you have is just a reflection of that process that you've been through. And once you kind of have that identity and that confidence, you start to be able to see through a lot of these people that, like we talked about earlier, like those PED users that would just have this kind of like bravado type persona and that kind of stuff. And it takes maybe someone like me or you, or an intermediate lift or whatever, to be able to kind of see through and actually see what it is at its true value.
I would even go as far as to correct you when you say that this is not uncharted territory. I think that any new discovery you make as a human, even if it was discovered by someone else, is still new because it's new to you. It doesn't matter if the collective has done it already. What matters is what it does to you as a human. It's still progress. You're still advancing. And it comes also to a point where I believe that this is why natural bodybuilding is so great. It's because you're discovering yourself as you advance. You're making a statue, but I think the statue already exists. The statue is your ideal. The actualization of the statue and the process that we talk about, this is what is going to build you, because at the end, you'll have an identity. You'll have a physique and you'll have an identity. There's a certain type of sentiment that's a nihilistic sentiment in modern society. You hear a lot where people say, oh, born too late to explore the world, born too early to explore the galaxy, born just in time to browse memes or be a consumer. These people are dead wrong, because they are forgetting the most important thing, and that is the self. As long as you have the self to explore, you have plenty of work to do. But until you can turn inward and actually look inward, that'll never happen. These are people with no identity. They seek distractions outside of themselves to forget the fact that they are something, that they are a being. As a natural bodybuilder, you can't do that. You are forced to look inside, to look for the mistakes, to look for the issues that you might have. It might even fix you up psychologically. All of that via lifting weights, which is why when I hear people say, oh, just do the work, really? This is not just about lifting iron. It's not just about volume. It's not just about bench press. This is it. This connects to everything. This is why my channel is about philosophy and lifting. It's not a philosophy and lifting channel. It's a lifting philosophy channel, because the two are the same.
I'm with you there. I think there's been a huge distraction. I know this is a bigger topic we might have to save for another time, but when you get into distracting people from focusing on themselves, you're not going to be happy. And ultimately, you're not building up yourself just to save it for yourself. When you're a better person, you can help other people too. And I think this whole movement of making people shy away from things that actually improve themselves, well, you hear this all the time. Well, you waste all your time in the gym. Actually, you had the video on that. You had a video talking about, oh, well, every minute a bodybuilder wastes doing a bicep curl is a minute he could have been doing something more productive or helping other people. And I think you did a great job of debunking that. And that's something that I agree with you on. And I think when you distract people, like you said, and you move people away from focusing on themselves and building themselves up, they're going to remain weak. And a weak person that has no resources to help other people remains that way. And I think ultimately that's selfish. Letting yourself become a person with no value. Well, now you're not doing anything for yourself, but you're not doing anything for other people, which is what you were brainwashed into doing in the first place. But when you become selfish for a little bit and become a person that can lead other people and help other people, now that selfishness isn't so selfish after all. So I agree with you, and I think you make some really good points there too.
Yeah, and I think this is the perfect point to end this video on. You said it all. We are surrounded by a system and people who would rather you look at them than look at yourself. Ask yourself this: who benefits from that? It certainly will never be you. It is always them. So selfishness is a key trait of any lifter and of anyone of value. I would agree and argue as well, because if you want to be of use to as many people as possible, you will have to first and foremost build something of value to give others. Stay weak and stay resourceless. You will be the one that extends the hand and asks for help. You will never be the one to actually pull people up.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's a perfect point to end on. So yeah, NH, thanks a ton for coming on. Where can people find you at? Do you have anything else you'd want to say before it's over?
Well, I focus all of my efforts on YouTube. I make very long videos, so it's going to help you also work on your attention span. I have an Instagram where I post pictures of myself shirtless. It's not interesting at all. So I'm all focused on YouTube and building the natural community.
Perfect. Well, thanks a ton for coming on. I will see you guys soon.